you could feel that something was happening, and everyone in the chamber could see that she was upset, and it was just really difficult to watch. I have honestly rarely seen anything like that. And that just created this feeling of total instability. Welcome to another episode of The Division Bell. This week, we're going to be discussing Starmer's first year in office, Rachel Reeves, and we'll be joined by Luke Sullivan, Labour's former political director. I'm Lizzy Buchan.
I'm Christian Calgie.
And this is The Division Bell.
What a week. We saw each other in Parliament yesterday after Prime Minister's questions, and I said, it'd be a good podcast.
You smugly ran off down the corridor being like, oh, great.
I was running off to make urgent phone calls to the Treasury to find out if our Chancellor of the Exchequer had offered her resignation that morning.
Yes.
As was the rumour that emerged after Prime Minister's questions, during which Rachel Reeves was crying on the front bench.
It was an extraordinary day. I mean, this week has been extraordinary. You can't leave PMQs. Once the Prime Minister's there, once it's started, you can't walk out. So she had to sit there for the whole of this excruciating half hour with everyone aware that she was crying. It was on television. Everyone was tweeting about it. I just thought there was a moment where I think most people would feel, whatever your views are on Rachel Reeves's policies and her political career, that moment of sitting there and just you can't escape.
It was absolutely nice.
It makes me feel awful.
Yeah.
In the lobby briefing after the PMQs, the PM's press secretary immediately was like, the Chancellor's going nowhere, full confidence, all of this. And so we were all there desperately wanting to tweet this out and stuff like that, because they'd had to essentially clear up the fact that Starmer hadn't really been clear, and that had sent hairs racing. But I do think it's important to reflect as well that the Treasury, her spokesman in the Treasury said that this is a personal matter, and the PM last night also came out and said this is nothing to do with politics. My understanding was she is not considering her position. She hasn't offered her resignation. It's something else. And that is really difficult because on the one hand, of course, every politician is human. If something really challenging is going on in the Chancellor's personal life, it's not unusual that would upset you. But the Chancellor's tears move markets.
Yes, it wasn't personal. It was public.
The bond markets, were moving, government borrowing costs rising, the sterling falling, which, shows you that despite any criticism of Rachel Reeves that might be thrown at her by the right, that the markets really don't want her to be replaced.
No. And that's because they worry that any replacement will be we'll borrow more, we'll tear up the fiscal rules, and could even lead us down a Liz Truss quasi-quarting path, albeit the current yield rate is not dissimilar to what we saw with the mini budget.
After a long time reporting from Westminster, I feel that there's something just about vibes, right? There's just something in the air. Yeah. You can always tell when it's going to be a big day, when something's happening, when actually there's jeopardy, because you can just feel it.
It's electric.
In the air.
Yeah.
And yesterday, I just felt you could feel that something was happening. And everyone in the chamber could see that she was upset, and it was just really difficult to watch. And I think there's been this wider feeling over the last few days about the government just not really being in control of some parts of what it's trying to do. The welfare reforms, which happened the day before the government, 90 minutes before a vote, gutted its welfare reforms. I have honestly rarely seen anything like that. And that just created this feeling of total instability. I think they're trying very hard to get back to, just business as usual, all of that.
I believe, like everyone on the right, that the welfare bill has to come down substantially. But I just think these were terrible reforms. They don't help anyone into work, which should be the number one priority. They, even with the concessions, they were going to leave 150,000 more people in poverty. And, I think surely the strategy needed to be a wider discussion about, should you be getting PIP for things like anxiety or alcoholism, as we've seen, or things like, rather than taking PIP away from people without limbs who actually need help. And my concern now, I think the concern for everyone, and probably the concern of Rachel Reeves, who is genuinely trying to be fiscally responsible, is, has too much political capital been thrown away here to the point that Keir Starmer will be completely unable to actually come forward with proper welfare reforms for the rest of this parliament?
At the weekend, I looked back at some footage of the early days, and it does really feel like a different world. But this year has been absolutely a million miles an hour. I'm going to pick out some highlights. I think you're going to pick out some lowlights. Yeah. But I mean, the government has maybe struggled a bit to get things to cut through, but actually they have done a lot of stuff. I mean, for me, I think some of the highlights are the improvements in the NHS and the money put into public services. We were concerned about, would the government, talking about the fiscal inheritance being so bad after the Tories, were they going to pursue an austerity strategy, which they are not. Rachel Reeves did a big budget. She put money into public services. She raised taxes to do that. But, that is something that I think was bold. I think they are gripping the issues of systemic underfunding in public services. And also they have decided in the spring statement to put loads of cash into long-term infrastructure projects, improving public transport outside of London. I think that's all brilliant. On a personal level, one of my highlights was the expansion of free school meals to 500,000 additional kids. This is something the Mirror's been campaigning on for 3 years. I'm really thrilled by that. I think that's the kind of thing that our readers wanted to see from this government. And also I would pick out foreign affairs. I know that it's not always something that gets a lot of votes, but I think
it can lose a lot of votes if it goes badly.
But I think the PM has shown real leadership, and I think everybody would accept that on Ukraine. And after the Trump-Zelensky meltdown meeting in February, the PM really brought Zelensky close, brought him to London. There were those amazing scenes of people cheering on the streets. He hugged him outside Downing Street. Number 10 officials were straight in there trying to get the talks back on the table, trying to sort of smooth all of that over. And I think that is something that we should be really proud of.
I think he's done his best with Trump.
He has done his best with Trump.
He's done
pretty well.
Possibly the best of any world leader. Or certainly ally world leader. With Trump, there are some enemies that seem to have good relationships. But now I've been kind and generous. One
small kind thing, thank you.
Let's. I thought. I mean, it's a long old list, isn't it? We had winter fuel payments, which we do agree on, was an enormous misstep.
Yeah.
We had the freebies. That's almost faded into the background now. Small boats. Are a disaster. They're the worst on record so far this year. Southport, actually,
I thought it was well handled.
It was handled well at the time. I do think there's a question about whether some people who are in prison for tweets should still be in there, but I get you've got to put out the pan fire as quickly as possible. And immigration more broadly, obviously we had the introduction of Sir Enoch Starmer, which is a speech that has since been rowed back on.
Well, I think he regretted using the words "island of strangers."
Forgot to read a speech.
I'm delighted to be joined today by Luke Sullivan, a Labour veteran who is now working for Headland. You worked obviously for Keir Starmer's Labour Party as political director, and before that in the chief whip's office. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Can't quite believe it's been a year.
I know. Yeah, where has the time gone?
Has it gone obviously you've been observing it from the outside. Has it gone as you expected it to?
Yes and no. I was always of the view it was going to be really tough going. And I remember having a chat with somebody and I just said, we were saying, look, I think it's going to be really difficult. There's going to be so much anticipation and expectation. So many people have, lent Keir and the Labour Party their vote because they were so, it was a sort of generational shift and people just fed up. It's been a really tough year, but I also think there's some real positives that have come out of it. I think maybe haven't necessarily found a way of telling that in a sort of, I think it's the Prime Minister said, like in a compelling narrative. But, I think there are many things to be positive about.
Do you think that the Labour MPs have really taken that on board? Because it seems like they're not nearly as willing to make the difficult choices as the government are at the moment.
You often go to the point of when you have these huge political problems in political parties, like how did we get here? We've had the usual, we must sack all the politicians, all the staff, and it's this one moment in time. Problems are never one, almost are never one mistake or misjudgment or fault. It's a series and a compounding, and which is why I don't sort of subscribe to some of the nonsense that's been going around the last week. But I also think if MPs want to have more of a involvement, they also have to accept that they have to be part of taking some of the really tough choices. And yes, like welfare, I think is a very special issue for the Labour Party. It's always been a sort of Achilles heel of any Labour Prime Minister who's tried. It's a sort of, if you go there with a very clear plan, like, roll the pitch, you're going to spend a lot of time and energy on it. And even then, things can go, massively wrong, as sort of Tony Blair saw in actually not in too dissimilar a set of circumstances to what's happened this past week. But Labour MPs have got to make a choice. You can't have the nice things and just say no, or this is what we want, when the inheritance is as bad as it is. I remember when in opposition, Normanshire South, which is the building where the leader of the opposition suite was, even though in the parliamentary estate would often feel miles away from sort of like the bulk of what was going on.
You have to, for our listeners, you have to sort of walk through a little outside courtyard, which is effectively a smoking area to get there. So
it's very classy.
They have to walk through two.
Yeah.
And then under a tunnel.
It was quite a good place, though, because you could hang around there sort of pretending to smoke and wait for people to get out of shadow cabinet meetings.
But geography matters, and, the people are in number 10 or they're in their departments. It's not just a PM number 10 thing. It's also ministers as a whole. The best ministers, the ones who are like closest to their colleagues, sadly are the ones who sort of have the time, and it is very, very difficult, but have a bit of a routine of going in the tea room and like seeing their colleagues, picking things up, being accessible, being in the voting lobbies. It's every time my eyes roll, every time someone says let's basically bring in electronic voting so you don't have to come to physically there. Actually, I'm going to sound completely sort of like stuck in my ways, but it does matter, human relationships and interactions. And one of the great powers of our system, and for all of your readers, they have brilliant MPs, like whatever political party they are. The best ones, when they got a problem, they will be on a mission to find the minister and hunt them down, come bump into them on the chamber. And that is, sadly, often how things get done, because the minister's gone, right, I've just been bothered by this person like 3 times. Private office, what on earth is going on? Like, sort it out. And that is one of the refreshing things about our democracy.
So do you think that everyone, from the Chancellor to Morgan McSweeney to the Chief Whip, do you think they're all safe for now, or do you think that there does need to be a reset of some sort in the coming weeks?
The idea that we're going to go around, that the response to this is going to be blame. Like, yes, some of that is clearly playing itself out through some of the newspapers. Like, that's not going to help the country. And it's not Keir. Keir is, and it's one of the things that I think is quite unusual in a political leader. And I think it is also comes from how he is, how he does he approaches life. He's much more about how do we fix it? How do we look? We're in a problem. Like, we need to find the solution. We need to move forward, and he's done that consistently. I don't think you should confuse that with like what is a reset. And I think we saw that. I think we saw the signs of that 2 weeks ago. We saw the signs of, the Prime Minister, one, just accepting things had gone wrong. I think that was a very, very human thing for him to do, and is actually very unusual in politics. And, actually often seen as a sign of weakness. I think that's not true. I think in many, in the real world, in business, like leaders standing up and saying, like, I take responsibility, but this is what we're going to do. I know that is what Keir will do, and I know that's the approach. I think the other thing that absolutely they cannot do, they cannot confuse it's been difficult on welfare with that they can't go into their shells. Like, this country is absolutely crying out for change. The reason the government, why Keir won the landslide he did, was people were sick and tired. They know this country doesn't work. That means, like, the government has to be even more ambitious. It is really ambitious, but it also means they have to keep pushing on and delivering the change. Like, Keir will be absolutely steadfast I've never known somebody who's better and relentless at focusing on a strategy. Once he's got his strategy, he knows what it is. They've said it publicly that they know that the big task is, do people feel better off at the time of the next general election? Do they feel that public services have improved? And he will be absolutely relentlessly focused on it. Yes, there are bumps on the road. Yes, the first year has had some difficult things, but there's also been some really big successes. We've got the NHS 10-year plan today. Government announced, had an ambition of 2 million extra appointments. It's 4 million. Like, we are seeing waiting lists come down. We're seeing record investment in some of our public services. Huge money. There are great things that are happening.
You obviously worked with Keir Starmer for many years, and you will have an impression of him as a person. I've always been struck by, there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes between the way the public perceives him and how he appears privately. What is your impression of him as a man and as a kind of leader?
Yeah, I mean, he's an incredibly smart, intelligent, warm person. I think first and foremost, it's a public service duty. I mean, he's gone into public service, into politics at a relatively later age in life. He's not like so many of, it's not like me, somebody who's grown up in the Westminster bubble. He's had for want of a better word, a proper job. He has excelled at, he's excelled in his field, and he's got an exceptionally broad hinterland. I think that colours and that improves his leadership and how he approaches things. I think he's also quite, he's funny and warm. He's also like the most competitive person I've ever met in my life, to the point, and I know it's like a cliche, and I've heard him today talking about football, but like, I've genuinely never met somebody more competitive than him. He is, to the point of, at times when you play football with him, you're like, I really didn't expect this. I'm not sure, even in a work setting, like, to the point of berating people he's played with. Like, he is so ambitious. It's incredible.
It's not him at all.
No.
I once told him I support Tottenham, which is obviously, he's an Arsenal fan. And he looked at me like I had just punched him in the face, and he couldn't find a way to recover from it. He was like, well, you could change team, I suppose. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that, am I?
But I think the other thing that I do think shines through, well, he's deeply private and about his family. He clearly adores Vic. Like, they are such a tight partnership. But like, his kids, like his protection of his kids, like I think he's such a deep family man. Like, that guides him. And yes, he wants to be the best Prime Minister he can be and do that job, and he knows that means that him and his family have to take huge, like, personal sacrifices, but he also finds time to carve out time for them as a family. And I think that's a really good thing. I think it grounds him in, yes, it's a really important job, and he wants to improve the country and change people's lives for the better. But he's also tries to find that equilibrium of ensuring that he also is a dad and a husband and and I think that really shines through.
So you worked for many years in the Whip's office.
Yeah.
Can you tell our listeners what that actually means?
A good question. I mean, essentially, and this is in the Labour Party, other political parties, I think, approach it slightly different ways. Whips are in this really difficult position of trying to manage to get through, if it's a government, a prime minister in the government's business, to, persuade, cajole, get them into the right place to help manage the MPs. But they also have to be able to tell the prime minister really difficult things like, I know this is what we want to do, but I don't think it's deliverable. I don't think it's possible. We're going to have to do it different ways. So they're in this unique position of sort of looking two ways. Essentially, the Whips is organised. I think there's about 15 Whips. There's about 3 or 4 senior Whips. And then the sort of, the main bulk of sort of 10 or so Whips will all have a regional or national spread. So you'll have a Scottish Whip, a Welsh Whip, and then you'll have like a London Whip.
And they'll look after like
and
a bunch of
they'll
everything,
look after. I mean, and in the Labour Whip's office, we call them, well, they do call them groups. They don't call them flocks. That's a Conservative thing. Yes, there's this sort of mystique, and there's a bit of
dark arts, bit of tongue twisting.
Ultimately, and I can only speak for the chief whips that I've worked for, and that's probably quite a lot in the history of the Labour Party. All of them are very different, but they've always approached it in the same way, which is, however big you think the vote before us is, there's going to be a bigger one coming down the track. And the ability to maintain that relationship with your colleagues, not to burn it, is very, very important.
So you're saying there isn't a filing cabinet full of, documents on Labour MPs, the naughty things they've got up to that are brought out,
like there is with the Tories.
I mean, look, it's the thing of, and I understand. Look, I very much enjoyed House of Cards, both the original and the Netflix update. It's just not how things work, and I don't know whether that is how things have ever worked, but it absolutely wouldn't work with this generation of MPs. The idea, in an age of every journalist has their smartphone, their numerous channels with WhatsApp groups, that whips would go around threatening people. It's not the way that any chief whip or whip's office I've worked in ever operates. I also just don't think it would work. I think you'd have a massive scandal if anyone tried it. But actually, the most compelling way to persuade MPs to do what you want or what the government want, isn't rocket science. It's persuasion in terms of the argument. Then it's probably begging in terms of party loyalty.
Yeah.
And it's friendships. It's knowing the interrelation, who knows who. How do you persuade people to be there? And and I think I think the Labour Whip's office are genuinely the best in the business.
What did you think from looking from the outside? I mean, presumably the Whips did know. They must have known that many Labour MPs were angry, because I knew that.
Yeah, I think there's the Whips have, I from what I understand, have been very clear over a sustained period of time what the level of uncomfortableness and difficulty was on this issue, and I don't think nobody seems to be saying that's in any doubt. I mean, it was also in the public domain. Whips do have that role of saying what's going on and where things are. That doesn't mean that's what necessarily the decision, but
they would communicate
that they would communicate, and
the
but
government.
that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that. I remember in the dying days of the last Labour government, when I was a special advisor in the Whip's office, and one of my senior colleagues, his Whip's office nickname was Grid Boy, because every vote, and it was every difficult vote, but it was basically every vote. We had 40, 50 Labour MPs who started off in we're not sure where they're going to vote, and pretty much every vote started difficultly, because of essentially what happens at the end of, all governments is you have a combination of those who are never going to support you, those who are just, have been a minister and are very unhappy and upset. This is what happened to the Conservative Party. So you have to you can't, just because you've got a load of people who don't like something, not do it. And I think this goes back to the point of, my advice to the government, if they ever, and I'm sure this is what they're going to do, which is they have to carry on the reform. It can't knock their confidence. I do think welfare on this issue is an isolated issue. And just because you've got people who are unhappy doesn't mean that you don't carry on the process and engage.
Thanks for watching another episode of The Division Bell. Join us again next week. But in the meantime, follow us on social media. Bye for now.